So today's daf is perfect. It's a new Mishnah. So it's the top of, I don't remember which one, Kuf Lamed Amid Aleph, 130. And so we are in the middle of Parak Yesh Nochalim, which is a very fun and challenging parak at times, talking about the Seder of the Yerusha and all of those details. And our Mishnah actually is a little bit of a continuation of the previous Mishnah, which we had 3 or 4 days ago, where the Mishnah talked, and the last few days we've talked about this extensively, about a person trying to change the Yerusha, right? The Torah says the Bechor gets double, every other son gets one portion. If there are no sons, it goes to the daughters, no daughters, it goes to his brothers, father first, then brothers, uncles, etc. But what if a person changes that? So we had in the last Mishnah that it really depends, right? You can give a gift to anyone you want. That doesn't matter, but you can't call it Yerusha if you switch the order, right? It's not Yerusha. It's not what the Torah says. And if you do that, lo amar klum is what the previous Mishnah said, because it's against because hitna al mash katuv b'Torah, right? And then we had a whole discussion about what if you say the words matana and the words Yerusha and whatever, all that case. Today, the Mishnah continues from there. So it says the Mishnah top of Daf Kuf Lamed, ha'omer ish ploni yersheni. If a person says, I want so-and-so to inherit me, presumably so-and-so is unrelated to you, like a stranger. B'makom sheyesh bat, but you have a daughter, right? So it sounds like from the Mishnah, you don't have any sons who would go first. Daughter goes second, but you, instead of giving it to your daughters, you say, I want to give it to, I don't know, right? Joe. So then, or you say, Biti teresheni, I want my daughter to inherit me, b'makom sheyesh ben. So you have a son, it should go to the son. You don't like your son, or you don't think your daughter needs it more. You say, I want to give it to my daughter. Says the Mishnah, lo amar klum. That has no effect. Shehitneh amasha katuv b'Torah. Because you went against the Torah. The Torah has an order, a clear order. If a person dies, no sons, it goes to the daughter. There's no daughter, it goes to his brothers. Right? All the psukim are very clear. What you said is inaccurate. Now, we're going to be mendayek from the Mishnah, in the Gemara, sorry, and the Rashbam says it here, that this implies that the problem is not that you change the order of the Torah, but that you change the class from the Torah, right? You have a son and you said it should go to daughters. But had you had 3 sons and you said it should go to one of those sons, right, then it seems from our Mishnah so far that wouldn't be a problem. The only issue here changed from either going to the daughters to going to a stranger, or changed from going to the sons to going to a daughter. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says, well, actually, and we've quoted him many times already, this is the source, Im amar amisha ra'oi liyarsho dvarav kayamim. If you designated your Yerusha to someone who is part of the Seder Yerusha anyways, then actually you can do it. You can change the Torah. If the Torah said, give it to all your sons equally, and you say, I want to give it all to one son, that's okay, as long as that son is in the Yerusha. It's not a stranger. The amish ein ra'oi lo liyarsho, take out the word maybe, those who are not in your Seder Yerusha, ein dvarav kayamim. Then you said nothing. So the Gemara asks now, and I set up this Gemara for obvious reasons, that the Mishnah implies that the Tanakama says it doesn't work because, now quote the Gemara, Taima, the reason it doesn't work, what you said to change the Yerusha, is da'acher b'makom bat. Because you went to a stranger when there exists a daughter, or you went to a daughter, bat b'makom ben. You went to a daughter when there was a son, implying in the Resha of this Mishnah, haben bein habanim. If you said, I want to give it to one son among my many sons, or bat bein habanot, or one daughter among my many daughters, then dvarav kayamim. That in fact you can change the Yerusha, you just can't change it out of class. I'm going to keep using that word. You could change, right? You can change it in numbers, supposedly, right? You can give it to one of the many sons, but you can't change it to a different category. But then look at the Seifa, Ima Seifa. Rabbi Yochanan Broka comes along and says, well, Im Amar al Mishra or the Yerusha Dvarav Kayamim. If you say, I want to change it to someone who in fact is supposed to get Yerusha, then what you said is true. But that's exactly what Tanakama says. Hainu Tanakama, right? Because, and that's why I introduced the previous Mishnah implied that you can't make any changes at all, right? No changes are allowed. The Torah says how to do it. If you call it a matana, you can do whatever you want. But if you call it Yerusha, you can make no changes. But this Mishnah now seems to say you can't make changes from a son to a daughter, but you can make changes within a son. But that's all Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka said, right? You can make changes from one son to another. So what's the context? Our Mishnah doesn't make any sense. How do you have one opinion and then bring Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka as a new opinion when he says the exact same thing? Says the Gemara, 1 second. That's not such a big question because you're assuming that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka only permits you to choose who you give it to if it's one child among many sons. So maybe Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka actually goes beyond that. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says that if you have a son and a daughter and a brother and a father, you can say, I want it all to go to my brother, who's the fourth in that order, right? It goes son, daughter, father, brother. But maybe you can do that. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka is saying even where there is a son, you can go to a daughter, you can go to a further relationship. V'chi tema, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, afilu acher, by acher we mean here a further relationship, not a perfect stranger, b'makom bat, that maybe your brother in the sense, even where there is a daughter, or even bat b'makom ben kamar. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, in fact, that's exactly what he's arguing with the Tanakama about. Tanakama says you can switch the Yerusha by choosing one person within a class, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says you could even choose outside of it. That can't be the case because we have a beferish Braita which says it's not true. Our Mishnah doesn't say that. But Vatanya, we have a Braita and we have a great source. And the source is Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka's son. Says Rabbi Yishmael, the last narrow line. Rabbi Yishmael ben Nosho, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer. Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, said, I was there. I know what happened. I was in the room, right? Lo nechliku Abba v'chachamim. My father and all the rabbis who argued about this, they did not argue al acher b'makom bat. If you're trying to give Yerusha to a stranger, and again, a stranger could be your brother, but a farther relationship where there is a daughter, or where there's a daughter, bat b'makom ben, right? My father did not argue with the chachamim. Shelo amar klum, right? Because if you try to do that, ineffective. You cannot put your daughter before your son, right? Charlie got my Hamilton reference. Okay, so you can't do. I never saw Hamilton, obviously, but my daughters sing it. But you can't put. You can't. Everyone agrees, not to get distracted here, that everyone agrees that you cannot give precedent to a daughter if there's a son, or to a brother if there's a daughter. The second wide line of Taf Kuf Lamed. What, in fact, did my father Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka argue with the Chachamim about? Al ben bein habanim. If you're trying to preference one son among many sons, or bat bein habanot. She'aba omer yirash. My father said that sure, you can do a Yerusha for one son among many. And the Chachamim who argued with my father Omrim, lo yirash, that you can't do that. So now stop here. This is the end of the Braita. You see very clearly from Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka only says you can make Yerusha go from one son among many sons. But if that's all Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka is saying, then that's exactly what our Tanakama is saying. So what is the chiddush of our Mishnah? How could you have two opinions?
Is the Bechor in the same class as the other brothers?
No, forget about the Bechor for a second. Remember we had, and we're going to have again in a second, at the end of today, that there's a special halacha about a Bechor that you can't change the status of a Bechor. And in fact, one of the proofs, I think a bias proof later today, of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, is that from the fact that the Torah says, Lo yivaker ben hasnua, ben ha'uva, ben hasnua, you can't change the Bechor, that's how we know you can change everyone else. Yeah. Right? But we'll get to Bechor in a second. But this is talking about the Pashut, right? This regular portion. So what is our Mishnah? How are there two opinions in our Mishnah? Says the Gemara, well, we've got two explanations. One is that Rabbi Shmuel's wrong, that he remembers his father saying this, but not every child gives an accurate report of what their father said. So Ibai Tema, right? Midika Amar lo nechliku, right? From the fact that Rabbi Shmuel had to stand up and say, nobody argued, implies that someone else in the crowd was saying they argued. Right? That's always why you're there to defend it. So Michlal the Tanakama Savar Nechliku. There's another Tanaic opinion, unnamed, who says that no, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka argues even in that case. And if Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka argues even in the case where you choose a daughter over a son, now our Mishnah makes a ton of sense. Because the Tanakama in our Mishnah said, unlike the Mishnah 3 days ago, Mishnah 3 days ago said you can't change anything. Comes along our Tanakama and says, no, you can change as long as it's not a daughter in front of a son, meaning it's not a different group. And says Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, no, you can even change groups. You can choose a daughter or a brother over anyone, even though Rabbi Shmuel disagrees that that's what his father said. That's what our Tana holds his father said. That's one explanation. The other explanation is that our Mishnah is missing one key letter, and it's not actually two opinions. Our Mishnah is one opinion. Our Tanakama is Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Ibaydema kula de Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Our whole Mishnah is Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. And of course, Chasurim lechasra v'achikitani, you have to just add a little bit of editing to our Mishnah in order to make that a reality. And this is now quoting the Mishnah in the edited version. Ha'omer, this will look very familiar. It's our Mishnah. Ha'omer ishponi yersheni. If a person says a brother or a father or whatever should inherit me, b'makom sheyesh bat, even though there's a daughter, or biti tersheni b'makom sheyesh ben, or a daughter should inherit me where there is a son, lo amar klum. Then it doesn't count because you're trying to change groups. However, now you, the smart reader of the Mishnah, understand habat ben bat ben habanot, sorry, a daughter among other daughters, or ben habanim im amar yirash konich chasav. If you say I want that kid, that son or that daughter to get everything, not to split it, divarav kayamim. Then in fact, what you're saying is effective. She, now we're adding the she is the main thing we're adding here. She Reb Yochanan ben Broka Omer im amar al misha ra'oi liyarshav devarav kayamim. So that is how you would have to understand our Mishnah according to the second answer. That our Mishnah is in fact one opinion, and the Reisha is basically saying if you change class, it doesn't work. But if it's within a class, it's okay because Reb Yochanan ben Broka said that's okay. Okay, so that is the opinion now of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka and the Chachamim, and pretty much like we go with Rabbi Yishmael the son, who said, my father only argued where it's within a group of people who can yorish. Now it says Rabbi Yudah Shmuel, 5 lines on the bottom, Halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. That's how we paskin. That if you want to switch around your Yerusha, you can switch and you can give it all to one child as long as it's in the group that's supposed to be yorish. V'chein Amar Rava, Halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Said Rava, I agree. That's the halacha. Now said Rava, Amar Rava, I'm changed to Rava. My time of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. What is the source for Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka? How does he know that a person can change the Yerusha that the Torah said and give it not 50-50 to two sons, let's say, or 50-50 to two daughters, but all to one daughter? How do you know? Because Amar Kra, the Torah says, and this is a passage we've quoted many times before, but it says, V'haya biyom hanchilo et banav. It's a verb, right? You're giving Yerusha to you're being manchil, you're inheriting, which sounds like a passive thing. You're causing to inherit, right? Implying that the father actually does something active. Now, if it's just the rules, there's nothing active, right? It just happens. You drop dead and it happens. But here it implies that you can actually take an active part in rearranging the Yerusha. HaTorah nitna reshut la'av lahanchil l'chol mi sheyirtzeh. The Torah has given the father permission to give it to anyone he wants. Now, we don't really mean that, right? A father cannot say, I'm giving Yerusha to the gardener, right? You can't do that. You can give it to anyone you want within the Torah's rules of Yerusha. So that's how we understand it. Amarle Abaya, now said Abaya, I don't understand why you have that, why you need that pasuk. Ha milo yuchal levaker nafka. I don't know why you would need a pasuk to tell me the father can do whatever he wants. The Torah very clearly says by a bechor, right? If you have two wives, one you love, one you don't love, you shouldn't, and the one who you don't love, as the Torah calls it, the ben hasnua, is the bechor. You have to give the bechor to that one. You can't choose the ben ahuva, the one you from the wife you love, over the ben hasnua. But that implies, says Abaya, as I quoted earlier, that you can't change the bechor, but you can change everything else. So why do you need another pasuk to say you can change everything else? Says Rabba, or that's why we say Rabba, right? To Abaya or Rava, depending on the girsa. Says it's Rava. I take it back. Rava and Abaya says Rava hahumi baile. In fact, that pasuk of lo yuchal levaker is needed for something else. L'kititani, as the following Braita says. Says the Braita now with the last line of Daf Kuf Lamed Amud Aleph. Abba Chanan Amar Mishum Reb Eliezer. This is a Tana, right? Abba Chanan, who was a Tana, I guess, said the name of Reb Eliezer, who was obviously a Tana. Mal Talmud Lomar, turn the page to Kuf Lamed Amud Bet. What in the world does the Torah come to teach us when it says, now we're quoting the pasuk, Lo Yuchal Levaker, that you cannot choose one over the other? Now, Rashbam understands that the question of Abba Chanan is that this pasuk seems to be extra, because the next pasuk says, give it to the Ben HaBechor, right? Yeah. So just say, give it to the Ben HaBechor. The Torah doesn't have to say to you, keep Shabbos, don't fight me. It's not a good example. Right? It does say, don't wear shatnez and repeat it kind of thing, or make a ma'akah, right? And don't not make a ma'akah. Right? The Torah says, give it to the Bechor. So you give it to the Bechor. Why do you have to come with a special pasuk to say, don't choose someone who's not the Bechor over the Bechor? Says Abba Chanan, why do we have to say that? Because there's another pasuk that says, V'haya b'yom hanchilot banav. It says you are allowed to be an active person in giving over Yerusha to your children. And I would have thought from that conclusion that that's referring to regular Yerusha. But if you recall, as we've discussed for the last week and a half, I guess, there's a big difference between the Yerusha you give to a regular child and the Yerusha you give to a Bechor. Because in a Bechor, there's a limitation. The Torah says by Bechor, and I'm going to read inside because I have the psukim in mind, it says, give latet lo pishnayim bechol asher yimatzei lo. Whatever you have in your hand. And we learned from there, and we had a great, beautiful Gemaras discussing that a Bechor only gets what's called muchzak, right? Only what the father has in his possession at the time of his death. But that which is ra'oi, that which is coming to the father, meaning it's owed by somebody else, or the father's father is going to die and give him Yerusha. The exception, of course, is Benot Tzlavchad in the land of Israel. But besides that exception, a Bechor is not notel in Ra'oi, in that which is coming, like he is in that which is Muhsak, that which already exists. That would be split even. A regular Yerusha, of course you get what's Ra'oi. If a father dies and leaves 2 sons, or 3 sons, let's say, and then he gets an inheritance 10 years later, $1 million, it goes equally to his 3 sons, right? So says the Gemara, you would have thought now, last word in the second line, Jiachol, you would have thought to say, hello dinu, it's a kal v'chomer. Ma pashut, right? The simple portion, pashut means the regular portion, which yafa kocho. That's a very powerful inheritance. Shenotel b'ra'oi b'muchzak. You get a portion in that which is not yet in the father's reshut when he dies, but is coming, the same way you get a portion in that which is already in the father's reshut. And still, haTorah nitna reshut la'av la'anchil l'chol mi sheyirtzeh. And the father is allowed to say, I don't care. Your 3 sons, let's do daughters, a little easier. 3 daughters, right? I can give it to one of them. So even though the daughters have a very strong chazakah in this thing, and I still can choose who to give it to. So I would have thought the Bechor gets a double portion, but he's got a pretty weak hand. Hurakucho, right? He's got a worse hand, or worse power. She'eno notel b'ra'oi b'muchzak. He does not get that which is future collections the same way he gets that which is current, right? So lo kol shekain. So I would have thought for sure you can change the Bechor. Because since you can change the Chelek HaPashut, and that's a stronger Chelek, you for sure should change the Chelek HaBechor. Talmud Lomer, therefore the Pasuk has to come and say, Lo yuchol levaker, that you can't choose. It's counterintuitive, right? Because you would have thought you could, but Torah says you can't, for whatever reason. Torah's got its reasons. So therefore, what says Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka now, you can change the Yerusha of a Pashut, but you cannot change the Yerusha of a Bechor. Says the Gemara, okay, but now, the Yomar lo yuchal levaker. Well, why don't you just say the words lo yuchal levaker? Say, you cannot choose the order of a Bechor, and I would know automatically, ma tamalom v'hayim yom hanchilot banav. Why would you have to tell me that you can change the order of regular kids? Because she yachol, I would have made a kal v'chomer, right? Halo dinhu. This is the answer. Halo dinhu. Ma bechor, think about it. A bechor, shehura kocho. A bechor is a weaker inheritance because eno notel b'ra'oi b'muchzak. He doesn't get future collections the same way he gets current collections. So Amra Torah lo yuchal levaker, the Torah says you can't change that. You can't mess with it. So I would have thought, pashut, a regular inheritance, meaning the regular portion, or if you got daughters, all the daughters, sheyafekocho, that's a really powerful inheritance because even if a father dies, that which he gets into his estate 10 years later goes to his children also. So shenotel b'ra'oi b'muchzak, I would have thought lo kol shekain that you can't change it. And you can't mess around with what's going on. So therefore, Talmud Lomar, that's why we need the second pasuk of Ahaya b'yom hanchiloat banav, that in the day that the father gives nachalat to his children, meaning HaTorah nitna reshut la'av la'anchil l'chol mi sheyirtzeh. A father can do whatever he wants within limits, right? He can't, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, give it to a non-related person, and he also can't change the Bechorah. But everything else is fair game. He can change anything else he wants. Amar Reb Zreika, we're at the 6th to last narrow line. Amar Reb Zreika, Amar Bami, Amar Bichanina, Amar Rebbe. I think the Bach adds another name in the way. Amar Rebbe Yanai, I think. Amar Rebbe. So clearly, this is a real, it's got a big Masorah, this psak, which is halacha Rebbe Yochanan ben Broka. Halacha. So this is the 3rd time we've seen this already, right? So clearly, everyone wants to pass like Rebbe Yochanan ben Broka. Amar le Reb Abba. Reb Abba said to whoever this was, Rabbi Zreka, sorry, no, don't say halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, say horeh. They paskined like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Itzmar, meaning that there was a circumstance where it actually happened. It's not a theoretical thing that Rebbe said the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. There was a case where Rebbe, three sisters came in front of Rebbe and said, our father left all his money to the oldest. Should get it together. And Rebbe said, that's okay. That's what you're allowed to do. Says the Rebbe, what's the difference between whether you say halacha or horeh? Halacha meaning he paskined that way. Horeh meaning he acted that way.
So it's like a horat shah.
No, that's a good point, but no, because Mar Savar, one opinion is halacha adif, right? If you tell me that Rebbe paskin that their three daughters came and Rebbe gave it to one over the other two, that seems like he's paskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. But we weren't there, right? We don't know what the circumstances were. Maybe there was some will where the father wrote, I'm going to give it away, like whatever. There could have been many other details. So saying halacha tells you this is what you put in the record books, right? So that's more powerful. But Mar Savar, the other opinion is that Maaser Rav, right? That's always much more powerful when you have a Maaser, because to say a theoretical halacha, that doesn't tell you that much, right? Because theoretically, Rebbe said this seems to be the halacha, but you don't know practically. Maybe if someone came to him and said, wait a second, our father left $5 million to this one, not to the others, he might have viewed it differently. Because sometimes when things are practical, you look at them differently. To say that Rebbe actually did it is much more powerful. Says the Gemara, let's dig into that a little bit. The second to last narrow line. Tanu Rabbanan. There's a Braita. This is a Braita in the beginning of Masechet Nida. So there's actually a very interesting Braita before this, but the Mishnah in Nida talks about a unusual halacha, not relevant to us, but then it says that this is how we paskin. The Mishnah says that. So the Braita in Nida says, you know what? Ein lemedim halacha. You cannot derive a final halacha lo mipi Talmud. There's different girsot here, but I'm going to read what we have in front of us. Not from the Talmud. Now, what does that mean, not from the Talmud? So the Rashbam explains it means not from the discussion that's going on. Right, you're sitting in the Beit Midrash and everyone's talking and they say it seems to be this way, but that's not enough. The fact that they say it seems to be this way is not a final psak. Velomi pi ma'aseh, and not from an action. You can't say I was there on Thursday and I sat in front of the Beit Din and I saw that a case came up where three daughters fought over Yerusha and they gave it all to one. That's because you don't know the circumstances. You just saw the final psak. You don't know all the arguments. Ad sheyomrulo halacha l'maaseh, until they say this is halacha for action. So you need to, in order to verify a psak, you have to know it explicitly. Sha'al va'amrulo halacha l'maaseh, right? If you asked, I'm going to read there's a couple different girsot. I'm going to read it which way I think the Rashbam reads it this way. Sheyomrulo, they said to you, halacha l'maaseh sha'al, that I asked and said, can I act this way practically, right? We all want to know if halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. But some of us want to know, can we give all our Yerusha to one daughter over the other daughters, right? And V'amrulo, and they say to you, the rabbis say to you, halacha l'maaseh, right? And yelech v'yaseh maaseh, right? That is, and they say to you, this is the halacha l'maaseh, and you can go and you can do it. The Rashbam really understands that what this last part means is that you can go and do it in future times, meaning you don't have to come back and ask every time. Because that would be a further extreme where the rabbi said, oh yeah, you can do that on Shabbos, let's say, but then next week you got to go ask again and see if it's still permitted because maybe the rules changed or something. That you don't have to do. Once you've asked and you said, can I act on this? And they said, yes, that's the halacha. So it's not enough for it to just be seeming to be the conclusion, which is the way the Rashbam understands Talmud. It has to be halacha l'maaseh. I'm gonna not read the last three words. I'll tell you what the Rashbam says here, which takes up half our page, which is that there's another Braita and the Rashi actually has this girsa, but there's another Braita in Nida, which says that you can never learn halacha mitoch mishnah, from the Mishnah, which is what the context is in Nida. And the Rashbam goes on a very big tangent here to say that that's true. And if a Mishnah says, and the Mishnah Nida says this, halacha kedivrei whoever, that does not mean we paskin that way. Because, says the Rashbam, the ruling is that Ravina and Ravashi were sof hora'ah. That's a quote from a Gemara in Bava Metzia, right? That Ravina and Ravashi were the end of psak, meaning that the definitive psak that we all follow is not the Mishnah, and it's not later, it's the Gemara. If the Gemara says halacha, that's the halacha, which is why the Rashbam has to explain that when it says you don't paskin from the Gemara, it doesn't mean that. So the Rashbam goes on this great discussion that is the halacha. Halacha is like a the Gemara. If the Gemara comes out at the end of a Gemara, halacha kedivrei, whatever, that's how we paskin. Okay, I'll see why in a second. It's a little problematic, but we don't paskin like a Mishnah. Now finishes the Braita in Nida, the last line, the last words on the first wide line.
The Rashbam says the Chacham ein talmidav lomdim misham halacha. That's where he says lo mipi Gemara. You're not learning from the Talmud, from the Gemara.
So you're not learning from the discussion that happens. So I explained it that way. You're not learning from the discussion that happens along in the Beit Midrash. But if the Gemara says, which the Gemara often does, right? At the end of the Gemara, the halacha is kedivrei whatever, the Rashbam understands that's it. It's closed. That's the psak, because that's what it means. But not the Mishnah. If a Mishnah quotes, and there are many Mishnayot, not many, but some Mishnayot that say that we go this way, it doesn't necessarily mean it, right? It sometimes does, but not necessarily. Now, ends the Braita, these words are very critical. Bivad shelo yidameh. As long, you can paskin, if you go and ask the Rav and say, is this halacha l'masa? And they say yes, you can do that and you can follow it for all time until you hear otherwise. As long as you don't derive, yidameh means you don't make a comparison. As long as you don't say, oh, he said I could do that, I'm allowed to do this. You can't make a dimyon, you can't make a comparison. So you cannot derive one thing from another. Says the Gemara, what in the world do you mean by that? That's all we do all day long, is we learn one halacha and derive another halacha. What do you mean you can't compare? Says the Gemara, Ravashi, Ravashi, remember, who is the Sofa Ra. So Ravashi, at the end of the Gemara, says that's not what it means. What it means is you're missing a word. There's a very specific segment of halacha where you have to be very careful about comparing one thing to another, and that is in regards to health, right? Especially specifically animal health, right? Because you might come to the conclusion that if you have a hole in the lung, it's puzzle. So if you have a hole in the liver, it's puzzle. But that's not necessarily true. The Tanya, because we have a Braita that says, Ein omrim b'treifot, zu domeh l'zu. You should never say when you're coming to deciding whether an animal's healthy or not, oh, I saw an animal like this last week, or the rabbi's paskin this way last week, and this is very comparable. Because al titameh, don't wonder about that. Because harei chotcha mikan umeta. You can take an animal and you could cut it. The Rashbam mentions means cutting a limb, like a gid. What do you call it? Yeah, but what's the gid? The sinew, right? The muscles. You cut a thing right below the knee, and it might die. And you could cut it 2 inches above that. Chotcha mikan v'chayta. And it will live. Meaning, it's not the cut, it's sometimes the location, it depends on the organ. Tosfos doesn't like the Rashbam's understanding, and he says that this means within one organ, that you could put a needle into one side of the spleen, the Gemara says, and it's going to die, you put a needle on the other side and it lives. So even within an organ, you can't ever generalize. So the rabbi said, oh, that's not a treifa, it doesn't mean that the next animal that has a similar kind of thing is not a treifa. Amar le Rav Asi Rabbi Yochanan, I'll say Rav Asi Rabbi Yochanan, 6 lines from the bottom. Ki amar lan mar halacha, right? When you tell us, sorry, Rabbi Asi said to Rabbi Yochanan, when you tell us ki amar lan mar halacha, hachi na'avid, right? Hachi na'avid ma'aseh, right? Are we allowed to act accordingly? Meaning, if you tell us, Rabbi Yochanan say to his students, halacha kedivrei whatever, can we then follow that halacha? Now the Rashbam is very bothered by what we're about to say, because according to the Rashbam, once Rabbi Yochanan tells you to do something, he's the Gemara, so you should be able to follow him. But says Rabbi Yochanan, Amar, he said to them, Lo tavidu, no. Even if I tell you the halacha is like Rev whatever, don't follow what I tell you. Ad da'amina halacha l'maaseh, until I tell you halacha l'maaseh. So the Rashbam says that this was a chumrah. That in fact, says the Rashbam, that if Rabbi Yochanan tells you something, you're allowed to listen. But Rabbi Yochanan told his students, be extra careful. Right? If you ever are going to act on what I tell you, I want you to ask me, is it halacha l'maaseh? But the Rashbam understands this, that this was an extra stringency.
Why don't you just say halacha l'maaseh every time?
He would, I don't know, whatever, because it's not, but not because, and the other point that they make is that if, obviously when someone comes to you and asks you a theoretical question, it's very different sometimes in how you consider it than if it's like, okay, can I go tomorrow and do X, Y, Z, right? So that Rabbi Yochanan was making that point. Now,
He has to say it's halakha l'maaseh.
Correct. That's what Rabbi Yochanan said to his student. Oh, don't do what I tell you to do. Don't act if I tell you the halacha unless I say halacha l'maaseh.
He has to say it.
Okay.
Yes.
While the Babli will often follow Rabbi Yochanan in opposition to Rav and Shmuel, who are in Bavel, there are lots of cases where in the Yerushalmi where the later Amoraim and Eretz Israel did not follow Rabbi Yochanan, which is really interesting that given that Rabbi Yochanan is given credit for much of the Talmud Yerushalmi.
Right. It is interesting. I mean, I don't, this is again beyond the scope, but when we talk about this Kalei Psika, which, the later,
Yeah.
late Shonim and early Achronim talk about a lot, the Bavli is, of course, not of course, but the Bavli is preferenced over the Yerushalmi, right? So
Yeah.
we do go with the Bavli. Amr Lahu Rava the Rav Papa, Uda Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yeshua. Now, Rava said something very interesting. This is the last Gemara we're going to do today. It's going to finish the daf. Rava, who was senior, said to Rav Papa and Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yeshua, listen, do me a favor, guys. Ki ati piska dedaina didi lekamaychu. If you ever, get one of my psakdim, you get the journal that has my latest tshuvot, right? V'chazitu be pircha, and you think that it's crazy. You see a pircha, you see a way to contradict it. You see something incorrect. Said Rava to these two, I guess he obviously respected them, lo tikra inu. Please don't tear it up, right? Don't trash me. Until you come to me and give me a chance to defend myself, right? Because look, I'm a very reasonable guy, said Rava. If I have an answer for your question, whatever your theoretical question is going to be, I will give you an answer. The elo, and if I don't, I will admit that I'm wrong. Hadrina B, I will admit that I'm wrong. I will be hadar. I will change my opinion. So look, I'm a reasonable guy. Do me a favor, give me the benefit. Don't destroy me if I say halacha. However, of course, the problem with Rava's principle is that Rava's going to die one day, right? And so what are you going to do if Rava's not there? So said Rava to these two students, la'achar mita, if I'm dead and you can't come talk to me, I still implore you, lo mikra tikra inu. Don't tear it up, even though you think it's wrong. But I'll acknowledge Migmar nami lo tigmaru mine, don't derive the ruling from it. Don't learn it, right? So you don't have to accept what doesn't make sense to you. What am I saying? Lo mikra tikra inu, don't tear it up and destroy it, because how do you know, right? You might not understand my reasoning. So di'i havai hatam, if I had been there, if I was alive and I could argue with you, I might have been able to rationalize it despite whatever theoretical question you're going to have. But I acknowledge that migmar nami lo tigmaru mine, you can't learn from it because, and this is a great, great principle that we use in many different contexts, the ein l'dayin elamash ein avraot. You can only paskin based on what makes sense to you. The fact that a greater earlier rabbi said you have to do this thing, right? If you read through their reasoning and it makes no sense to you, you can't follow it, right? Because even though the Chazon Ish, or to use an example of a great earlier rabbi, said something, if you're a dayan, and it doesn't make sense to you. Now, it's not, obviously it means where they gave a reason and you don't like their reason, right? If you don't know why they said it, then obviously it's very hard to judge it or one way or the other. But Rava gave a reason. The Ravina, these Rav Papa and Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yeshua, read it. The reason didn't make sense to them. Said Rava, I understand, but leave it in print. Because maybe it'll make sense to someone else in the future. I don't know. I can't defend it, but I understand you can't paskin because ein l'dayan el mashein avraot. You can only do what makes sense to you. You can never say halacha that does not make sense to you. Which I'm not a dayan, so for me this is not so hard. But for someone who is a dayan, this could be very challenging, right? Because there could be rulings that make no sense, and you have to start paskin according to them. And so this obviously gets to a complicated aspect of halacha. But
Shelo asani posek.
we're going to stop
I
there.
have no desire to be put in that. I love learning, but I have no desire to be put in a position to have to make these decisions.
God willing, we'll pick it up tomorrow morning. I'm sorry, Miriam, if it doesn't
No.
work. But I'm gonna let me see next week if I can make it, and we'll talk. If other people can work, we can.
Okay.
I'm totally fine with Sunday evening, but we have to figure out a time that works for everyone.
Of course.
Tomorrow, 7:45 a.m., which I think is 8:45, right?
Right.
Oh yeah, we're changing time. Yay.
An extra
Second
hour
Second time for
sleep.
me.
Can
I
we do
expect-
this every
okay.
year, every week?
What?
Do we get an extra hour sleep on Saturday night every week?
We could try. We get it on Shabbos. Okay, Shavua Tov, everyone. I'll see you.
Shavua tov.
you tomorrow
Tov, Yasher Koach.
Shavua Tov, good night.
Good
Hello?
night.
Yeah, that's it. Closing.